Hello, I'm Mike Pothier, the Program Manager of the Catholic Parliamentary Liaison Office. Today I'm speaking to Ann Bernstein, Chief Executive of the Centre for Development and Enterprise. Ann, can we start by learning something about your organization for those of our listeners who haven't come across it before?
Great. Well, Mike, it's good to be with you. And CDE is an unusual organization. We're a public policy think tank. We're totally independent. We have our own very powerful board, and our job is to help make South African democracy a success, see how we can make a contribution to getting faster growth and much more employment in South Africa, fix education, and generally help consolidate a successful democratic country.
Right. I think we're in the same kind of business then. That's also what we like to think that we're doing. You've put out a paper recently. I think it's a series of papers, but the one we're talking about today is entitled, "Are We Asking the Right Questions About Youth Unemployment?" Just before we look at those particular questions and hopefully at some of the answers that you are proposing, what was the picture of youth unemployment before the COVID lockdown struck us? And are there any more recent figures as well to show what the effect of that lockdown has been?
Look, the unemployment situation in South Africa is absolutely devastating. We put out a big document at the end of January 2020 called 10 million and rising about unemployment. And unfortunately, the numbers have been rising since then. The situation with youth unemployment is even worse, if you can imagine. And if you're a young person pre-COVID, aged 15 to 34, you're about 52% unemployed, that group of people. If you're aged 15 to 24, the numbers are even more startling. You're over 70% unemployed. So South Africa has one of the worst situations in the world, and we don't know the figures that have, we don't know exactly how this has been affected through COVID and the lockdown and the economic crisis now. There will be figures, but at the moment, the numbers are premature. They're up to the end of March. Yeah. So we don't know the effect, but we do know everything's going to be worse. So this is really the key challenge facing the country. How do we get millions and millions and millions of people into jobs?
Right. And so one of the thrusts of your paper, obviously, given the title and so on, is that we've not been asking the right questions when it comes to youth unemployment. So what are some of the key questions that we should be asking?
Well, Mark, maybe it's easy if I start with how people currently think about youth unemployment, the wrong questions, if you like, and then move to what we think the right framework is for tackling this enormous challenge. So many people are concerned about youth unemployment, and they come up with a range of things to do. They look at a group of young people and they say, gee, we must help these people become entrepreneurs, self-employed. That's one approach. We think that's a terrible approach, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Another approach is to kind of help people where they are, often in a rural area or a sort of apartheid place like Bushbuck Ridge or Orange Farm, and say, how do we help you? How do we help you where you are? And that is also not a very successful approach. Then there are people who want business to do more. They somehow, in the midst of a recession, which we were in before COVID, now much worse, they want business to hire more young people at the same time as they're retrenching other people. This doesn't make sense to us. So we think people tend to think about projects when they think of youth unemployment. They don't want to deal with the big policy issues. They want to run a project on how do we help you become an entrepreneur. The fact is that's a terrible idea, because we know quite a lot about entrepreneurship. Generally, you need some know-how, you need a certain level of education, and if you've worked in a sector for 5, 8, 10 years, you have a much better chance of finding that gap. You hate your boss and you think, I could produce this service or this product more cheaply, more efficiently, or something new. And you've then got a chance of getting something going. But if you think of South Africa's young people, many of whom, the vast majority of whom, through no fault of their own, have come through a terrible education system, often don't have matric, often live in communities where their parents don't work or very few people work. So they have very little understanding of the world of work. Yeah. And then you think, you must become an entrepreneur. You're setting people up for failure. So of course there'll be 1 in a million who might do something creative. That's fantastic. But the big issue about youth unemployment is scale. Scale, scale, scale. That's how we have to judge, is South Africa turning the dial? So small projects, small initiatives will help those people, and that's great. But if you're looking at the country as a whole and the devastation of youth unemployment, or how we deal with the politics of this issue and the future of our society, you have to think about scale. So we have a different approach to this, where we're saying that even the best project, special intervention, might help 10, 20, 30,000 young people. That's great. Don't stop. But this is not what the society should be focusing on if we are serious about dealing with youth unemployment. So let me turn to some of the things that we think people should be thinking about.
Right.
First, most important, you have to have a growing economy. Jobs don't live in a box over here and growth over there. You have to have a growing economy, and actually firms, and more firms are the very best projects we can think of for sustainable job creation. So that's the first thing, growth. And we have to take the tough decisions, the hard choices to get South Africa growing at a much faster rate than we have been for the last decade.
Can I just ask you at that point, the question of getting South Africa growing, the next thing one usually hears that we have to overcome the structural issues that are preventing that growth. But it's difficult sometimes to get a handle on exactly what those structural issues are. Everyone talks about them without necessarily identifying them in kind of lay language.
Right, right. Well, the key issues on growth, unfortunately, they get longer and longer, but they include the following. We have to deal with our fiscal crisis because the size of our debt is now affecting confidence among investors that we can pay back the debt and that we're a good place to invest. So there's a relationship. On the one hand, we need more growth to deal with the fiscal crisis. On the other hand, the size of the debt is having an effect on our chances of growth. That's one. Secondly, without energy, you can't grow the economy. So fixing the energy situation so that firms know they can have reliable supply of power is absolutely fundamental. There are a number of other issues. I'll come on to some of them in a moment. But the last I would mention in terms of growth is corruption. Unless you deal with corruption, it's hard to have confidence in the government of this society and that there's a firm hand on the tiller. So corruption is not only an attack on poor people, but it's a constraint on growth. There are many other things, Mike. For example, our ports are very inefficient and they don't have enough capacity for the products we want to export. So we're one of the worst sort of port facilities in the world in terms of efficiency and cost. Think of transport and rail. There are a whole lot of issues that inhibit the economy. And then the last I'll mention before we come on to the other things is you can't be anti-business and hope to get growth. So we have attitudes about business that hold back this country from growing at a faster rate. That doesn't mean businesses are perfect, but if you keep having an anti-business attitude, you will impose more and more regulations and controls, and you will get less and less growth. So that's some of the issues about how we get faster growth, which relates to more and more firms that could employ more and more people. But the second part is South Africa's growth has become more and more capital intensive. We use machines more than people. And this is crazy because we're a country with an abundance of people who are desperately looking for jobs. So there are a number of recommendations we would make to push this economy in a more labor-intensive direction. So we're saying we need faster growth and more labor-intensive growth, so we get more and more jobs for every percentage of growth. Because you could have growth but not have more jobs. Okay. Yeah. So those are two very important things. But then we have to talk about South Africa's skills system, because we have a shortage of skilled people, even when the economy is in the doldrums, and we have an abundance of unskilled people. Yeah. We can't find enough jobs. So the fundamental cause of this is we need a much, much better skills training system. The TVETs are expensive, very inefficient, all sorts of problems with SETAs. But we also need to get much better value for money in our basic education system. Yeah. That's a big discussion, but people tend to ignore that. We need better trained, better skilled, better educated people in our workforce. We don't have that. And that brings me to the next issue, which is South Africa has to create jobs for the workforce we actually have today, not the highly skilled one we should have. I wish we did have, but we don't have yet. So you have to say, we can't have a strategy which says we want a high skill, high wage development strategy when you don't have a high skill population, not through their fault in the vast majority of cases. So South Africa has to look at how we open the door to more lower skilled and obviously lower wage jobs. That's how they've developed in almost every country in the world that didn't discover oil. Yeah. People have gone through a phase of moving off the land into the cities, into factories, where they're not fantastic jobs, but boy, they're a lot better than slaving away under your father, your brother, or whoever in backbreaking, very poorly paid, if at all, rural work. So we're saying you've got to look at the price we pay for workers, and we have to fix that as well.
Let me come in there and raise the obvious objection that one will hear, particularly, for example, from organized labor when you start going in that direction, and that is the question of exploitation of slave wages, in inverted commas and so on. In the more positive sense, the slogan, decent pay for decent work. We want not just any old job, but decent jobs. How do you respond to that?
Well, in a number of ways. So obviously, I am in favor of unions organizing and shouting the odds for their members. More power to their arm. But unions do not represent all workers in South Africa. The vast numbers of the unemployed are not represented. That's the first point. The second point is it's often assumed when people talk about decent wages or better jobs or all those things, that the alternative, you know, that South Africa has options. We want decent wages. My view is South Africa has to make up its mind. Do we want one of the highest unemployment rates in the world? Or do we want people to get a job, even if they're low-paying jobs initially? So you can look at China, you can look at Vietnam, you can look at Sweden in the 19th century or England in the 19th century. People start in low-wage, not great jobs. We're absolutely in favor of basic health and safety rules, which would be different from the 19th century, of course.
Yeah.
But we're saying that the alternative to decent jobs is no jobs at all. So it's not like South Africa has a choice. And I think we are the world's best example that going for the wrong strategy, which seems right, we want people to have a job with high conditions and high wages, is the right approach. The truth is you encourage unemployment. And that's exactly what government policy has done for the last 25 years. Employers cannot afford to pay the wages that people think are decent unless workers are producing value worth that much. And in a competitive world, that just isn't possible. But the issue of so-called bad wages, bad conditions, or bad jobs, people often look at a snapshot in time. And if you look at China, it's very instructive. But this is the case for all the Asian countries. You might start in a factory job making a t-shirt for low wages, and you might work long hours, but you don't stay there. In 5 to 7 years, the evidence shows people are moving up or out. So you can start your job making t-shirts, and then one day you can move to making my shirt, like a man's shirt, much more sophisticated, better pay. Or you can move to be a supervisor of other people making t-shirts. And what's happened in a lot of Asian countries is that disproportionate numbers of women take these jobs and they save little amounts of money, and they either move on to become entrepreneurs themselves, servicing the next round of workers from the countryside, or they go back to rural areas, but then they have some power. They can be an entrepreneur themselves. They're not going to be under the thumb of somebody else. And they put money into the education of their children. So their children are better qualified to start working at a different role. So we shouldn't think of this in a static way. And I think the key is people need jobs. And if you look at the numbers of people who apply for public works jobs in South Africa, where the pay is incredibly low per day, we have more people applying for those jobs than we have jobs. Yeah. And that shows us that there's no coercion here. People want to work. They want the self-respect and dignity of work. And we could be a much more labor-intensive society and start really bringing down the unemployment numbers in significant numbers, which we're not doing. All the talk of this and that and the next thing, we're not doing that. It's going up, not down.
When you talk about entrepreneurs and some of the examples you give of people who may have worked in the formal sector, you mentioned in China, for example, for a certain time, and then they sort of go on their own, they are in effect being entrepreneurs. That brings me to the question of the informal sector in our economy. If you like, the informal sector is a great well of entrepreneurship. People are opening up a hair salon, or buying a taxi and running that taxi, and all of the other ways in which people in that sector actually make a living, often under the radar, so to speak. There seems to be some sort of a disconnect between the many policies and ideas that are being put forward to improve the formal sector and make it more job creative, and and on the other hand, what's going on in the informal sector, where people are kind of doing it for themselves. Should we just leave the informal sector alone and not interfere with it, or are there actually ways of helping it to become more job creative and ways in which it can supply the growth that we need?
Well, look, we don't know enough about the informal sector in South Africa. And this is certainly an area CD is doing quite a big project this year to learn more and apply a lot more rigor to some of the numbers that are thrown around about how big or small and so on. So first thing is we don't know a lot of things. The second is that the vast majority of people in the informal sector are what you might call survivalists. They've lost a job, they haven't got a job, and they're finding a way to survive. And that for very many of them, there isn't a possibility of really growing a firm. So it's a kind of way of surviving and coping, but it's not really, I think of this as a third best alternative for South Africa. It's not what, obviously, we would advocate not allowing the informal sector to operate, not going after them within certain reasonable kinds of rules, but not excessive. So we should allow the informal sector to operate, to grow, but actually it's much better for people to have a job in a formal company. And if you ask, there are surveys that indicate that's what people would want. You know, I'm doing this until I get a job kind of thing, because you'll earn more. You also learn more in a formal job. So I think one's got to be careful not to romanticize the informal sector. This is a very diverse sort of set of activities, ranging from a lot of survivalist kind of activities to slightly bigger spaza shops operating to backyard household rental. Yeah. But the majority these are stopgap things. So I think there might be more potential, and we're certainly investigating that this year. But the way to think about the informal sector is in many respects a failure of the formal economy and society to include more people, which should be our first goal. How do we include more people in a modern, thriving economy where there are chances for firms to grow and hire more people and for workers to learn more on the job, and then you have more options of where to work?
And in that respect, one thing that often comes up is the need for more investment in infrastructure. And we've seen recently government has announced an infrastructure program running to 340 or 350 billion rands, apparently, looking at ports, which you mentioned as being one of our bottleneck points, road infrastructure, dams and other water supply, etc., etc. Very ambitious. We know we've had big plans in the past. What is your take on this latest package? Do you see that as potentially being some sort of a game changer?
Well, as you say, Mike, we've had lots of plans announced in the past, but nothing's happened. Some bad things have happened. Don't forget that Eskom, one of the reasons Eskom's in such a mess and in such fiscal difficulty is Medupi and Kuseli, and these were bad forms of infrastructure, badly managed, very expensive for South Africa, etc., etc. So infrastructure is like the new motherhood. Who can be opposed to infrastructure? But I think the current apparent consensus around the importance of infrastructure needs to be examined more critically. Not that we shouldn't do it, but that we need to ask some hard questions. What has prevented us actually getting more infrastructure going in the past? Have we been honest about those facts? And where we've messed up, are we honest about what's caused problems in the past? That's the first thing. The second is, what kind of infrastructure do we want now in the midst of all our crises? Is it economic infrastructure? Is it infrastructure there where, in a sense, you take big risks in getting money, often from overseas at high cost for South Africa? Is this infrastructure where you can generate sufficient economic activity to pay back the loan? So there's some big questions here. It's not simple. And then we have to look at, so is it the same corrupt government structures, weak and corrupt, that are going to contender for this infrastructure? And we know what happens then. So how do we get around the problem of a very weak and corrupted state in order to get the infrastructure going so that the country's money isn't wasted, or that some private sector greedy person takes us for a ride?
Yeah.
So the conversation about infrastructure is very important, but we need to ask and answer some very tough and serious questions about what kind of infrastructure, how are we going to do it differently from the past, how are we going to pay back the loans if we take them. So that affects all sorts of things about infrastructure.
Mm.
You're asking also about, can we make those activities, if we can get them going in the right way, more labor intensive? And that's an important issue. And we've actually written quite a lot about how South Africa can become a more labor intensive economy. And that does require some carefully calibrated reforms. We need to, for example, currently at the moment, we have bargaining processes for organized labor, and bigger firms get together and they make a deal.
No. Conditions,
wages, whatever. The problem is they're entitled to do whatever deal they want. The problem is that they can extend that deal through asking the minister to people who are not party to that negotiation.
No.
And in that way, you make the environment much, much harder for small firms, for new firms that just can't afford that level of wage or package deal and weren't party to the negotiation. So we're saying we need to change that, not to undermine collective bargaining rights, but to make sure they only apply to the people around the table and not as a way of keeping other firms out of that sector. So it's one way of making our economy more competitive and more inclusive. That's one issue. The other is, particularly for young people, we currently have something called, it's the only thing we have, which is called the employment tax incentive. Essentially, it's an incentive to employers to hire young people. There are all sorts of constraints, but that's the intention. And it's not perfect, but it's the first policy South Africa has which recognizes that the cost of labor affects how many jobs are created and how many people are employed. So we're very much in favor of this. We think it should be expanded to more young people for a longer period of time. And, but that could be one way, one additional reform to a package of reforms to help South Africa become more labor intensive. At the moment, we subsidize capital. Think of the motor industry, complicated subject, but we subsidize the most highly robotized, capital intensive sector in the world, is the car manufacturing. And we've chosen to do that for a whole lot of reasons, but it gives you an illustration of the choices facing South Africa if you want to be serious about the scale of employment.
I suppose that people in that industry and Department of Trade and Industry as well would say one of the complexities is that's a pretty big foreign exchange earner, that the motor industry, and therefore we've got to keep it going. And the downstream economy that depends on motor manufacturing is also quite huge. So as you say, very complex factors.
It's a complex issue. There's a document on our website if anyone wants to read about it. by one of the country's leading experts, David Kaplan. But he's saying that we never meet our downstream goals. You know, we never meet the goals to justify a lot of this expenditure. But that's just one example where South Africa subsidizes capital rather than employment.
Yeah.
And there are other examples as well. So that's just
how does moving towards a more labor-intensive economy, how does that gel with what we hear about the fourth industrial revolution, which is apparently something that we have to get on board with very, very quickly? That strikes me as quite a technology-intensive and probably capital-intensive direction to follow. Or am I wrong there?
Well, I think this word has come to embody, the fourth industrial revolution has come to embody all sorts of things, and people use it all the time without defining what they mean, which is not helpful. There's no doubt that the way we manufacture and all sorts of other things in societies across the globe are becoming more technology dependent. There's a big debate globally on will this lead to less jobs or more jobs? No. And the jury's out. Is this an issue for South Africa? Of course it is, because we have such an appalling schooling system and training system. But it's also true that, you know, what might be a buzzword at Davos 1 year doesn't immediately take place. It's going to take place over 10, 15, 20 years in different ways, in different countries, in different sectors. And South Africa needs to, in my view, stop obsessing about the latest thing, which is that, and obsess a lot more about how we teach our kids to read and write and understand things for meaning, and look for the job possibilities for the next 10 years or so. Of course, yes, you must also be looking to the future, but fix our education system. Stop all this fashionable stuff on everyone must have a laptop at school and everyone must do this and that. Our schools don't have water, never mind electricity, for large numbers of kids. So I'm not opposed to discussing seriously technology and know-how and what this is going to mean, but in terms of priorities for South Africa, I would say there are prior priorities before we can even have that conversation, and we shouldn't be distracted. We need to focus on the basics in South Africa today and get those right before we all start throwing big words around that we don't fully understand and their implications. So yes, we should be looking at this, but I really would much prefer the president and other people's attention being focused on how we get value for money, of the enormous amount we spend on basic education or secondary education, and how we help more and more people get skills and kind of get the kind of education you and I had.
You mentioned earlier the what you call the sort of anti-business attitude that is sometimes discernible from government. Now, recently, within the last few weeks, both organized business and the ANC have released major economic strategy documents. It was noticeable that these two things were drawn up without any consultation between the two sectors. And I got the impression that business was a little bit miffed that they hadn't, almost that their thunder had been stolen by the ANC releasing their documents simultaneously. Be that as it may, since then, quite a few people have said, well, there are a lot of common ground, there's certain synergies between the two documents and so on, or the two strategies. Have you looked at them? How do you feel about them? Is there really the possibility that these two players, shall we say, rather than opposite sides, but these two players can work together more effectively?
Look, Mike, this is a big question. Firstly, I am looking at all the economic recovery strategies and talking about those. I think that you can say there are two broad groups. The one would be National Treasury's reform document, nearly a year old now, and the Business for South Africa, very substantial contribution on how the country could recover. These two you could put in one group. They both want to get a much more, an environment that enables business to grow and more firms to emerge and to expand and more investment in South Africa. On the other side, you can see the ANC document, the Alliance document, the SACP, and so on, in a broad grouping where you could say there has been some movement in the ANC document, but the big thrust is how to discipline business, how to tell business what to do and how to do it. So that's one big divide. I think that the ANC and the business document are interesting, and the National Treasury. I think those are the three most important, and they certainly dealing with the most fundamental issues we face. Am I seeing more coming together? Well, no. On motherhood, you know, they all want infrastructure. They all want more growth. They all want more jobs. How to do it? The big challenge facing South Africa is, can we agree on some immediate priorities for action on the economic front that will work? And then how do we do them? Because we have a weak state and a corrupt state, how do we actually get it done? And this is very hard. So, and there are different points of view in the two documents. So this isn't a quick answer to your question. I think that I hope that the multiple crises South Africa faces, all exacerbated by the nature of our lockdown and the health and economic consequences of that, that the terrible devastation of this on jobs and firms could lead to some leadership. That's what South Africa needs. We need some leadership to find some really significant things that can be done together by business and government, and help give a feeling of hope and trust in citizens, many of whom have had a terrible experience over the last few months, and they didn't have much resources to fall back on, if any. So South Africa is presently gridlocked and leaderless on the economic front. And I think that's the whole thrust of what I've been saying, that if we're going to get the jobs we need to give hope to millions and millions of young and older South Africans, we're going to have to recognize what has failed in the past in an honest way. And then we need leadership from the president down, but mainly from the presidency, that says, I am going to do things differently. I am going to take some risks and make some tough choices. And there are trade-offs here. And that's what the debate should be about, the trade-offs and the hard choices that have to be made now if we are going to put South Africa on a new track which can provide hope for millions and millions of people.
And lastly, a bit of an unfair question maybe, but on a scale of 1 to 10, how confident are you that we're going to find that leadership in the near future?
Well, I'm an optimist. I'm not giving up yet. I thought the president took a very bold decision to lock us down so early at the end of March, and he did that decisively, and he had made up his mind clearly, and he took a whole lot of the country with him. If he can find that courage, then I think that South Africa will be a hopeful place. But I am concerned that that might not be the case. So I am still optimistic, not giving up, but we are really in very, very serious trouble, and we need some extraordinary leadership, and we're not seeing that at the moment.
And thank you very much. I think we'll leave it there. As you say, when we had the crisis of COVID, suddenly the government was able to find strength of purpose to do something drastic, and perhaps we need to keep ramming home the fact that our unemployment situation and our economic growth situation is also a crisis, and that we need a similar sense of urgency about what needs to be done. Ann Bernstein, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.